I'd leased an Airbnb for several weeks while I was between apartments. I had just moved out of my apartment and hadn't yet found another somewhere to live. So I kept all of my belongings in a storage unit for the time being. This Airbnb was in a little community about 30 minutes from where I previously resided. It felt like a peaceful town with little going on. Not the cleanest or finest place, but certainly not the worst. On one of my first nights there, I looked out the front window and noticed a couple of people standing outside the home. They were on the sidewalk, but definitely staring up at the house I was in. As soon as they saw me, they turned away and departed the area, making the situation even stranger than it already was. But I didn't think it was something worth investigating. I just closed the blinds and went about my night. However, nothing noteworthy occurred over the remainder of the night or the following morning. On the next day, in the afternoon, I dashed out to my car to retrieve a few stray items that I'd forgotten and observed a guy down the street. He was standing by the curb just one home over, and when we made eye contact, he gave me this strange stare, like if he knew me or something. It gave me the shivers, so I just looked away and went back inside. I wondered if it was one of the men I saw outside the house last night, but there was no way to know. When I saw those guys, it was too dark to see them clearly, and I'm not sure why that would warrant such a strange stare from this person. So, once again, I dismissed it as insignificant and did not worry about it. I needed to get some work done that day. So I worked on my laptop in the bedroom for several hours before spending another few hours going through apartment websites for anything good. I got up about 8, went back downstairs to the kitchen to make something quick for supper, and around 9, just before bedtime, I tied up the trash bag and took it to the bins on the side of the house. While I was out there, I discovered a small stone walkway leading into the backyard. To be honest, I had been preoccupied with other things throughout my few days there. I had never looked in the backyard. The trail simply reminded me, and I followed it through the fence gate. The backyard was walled in by an old, aged wooden fence, and from inside the home, it appeared small and empty, with only a fire pit in the grass. But off to the side, there was actually a shed, a very large one, built of the same worn wood as the fence and visible through the cracks. There was light, of course. Confused, I approached it. I listened for a bit, anxious that someone could be inside, but I didn't hear anything. So I opened it. Present was no one present. However, the small overhead light bulb was on before it was turned off. I looked about a little because this shed did not meet my expectations. I expected to see old, rusty tools and maybe a heap of rubbish, but that was not the case. The shed included an old couch, a few desks and dressers, but was otherwise vacant. I turned out the lights and closed the doors. I had that tiny voice in the back of my head telling me that it was very disturbing, that it appeared that someone had been in there, and that the light was on. But obviously that wasn't it. The light must have been on for several days before I arrived. I didn't notice it because I wasn't in the backyard. I went in and sat on the couch, planning to watch some TV before bed to clear my mind. I didn't make it to bed. However, the couch was one of those pull-out recliners, so I was virtually lying down while watching TV, and after only 30 minutes I was out cold. Hours later, I awoke to a thump. I opened my eyes immediately and heard it again. Someone was walking through the home. Their footsteps walked slowly down the staircase into the front hallway, and then toward one of the back rooms of the house. I almost didn't believe myself. It felt like a dream. I stood up from the couch, walked carefully to the corner of the room and then glanced around the wall. A figure stood in the darkness, facing away from me, as if looking around the room for anything or someone. I moved back out of sight. After a bit, his footsteps walked along the hallway and into the living room. I quickly moved to the other side, but before I could get anywhere else, I froze in the corner. As the man entered the room, he stood in front of me, his features obscured by darkness. His head shifted to stare at the couch, and he whispered something under his breath. "Where the hell am I?" A brief, impatient whisper to himself. He could not see me. I was in the darkest corner of the room, almost completely dark, but I knew if he moved any further in and got closer, he'd notice. But he did not. He only peered in and looked at the couch before walking away. His footsteps led to the back door, and he exited. I grabbed my phone and keys and headed out to my car. I contacted 911 and the Airbnb host, who did not respond. Police arrived, and despite the fact that the host had not responded to my call, he arrived only minutes later. The whole thing, however, was over in an hour, with almost nothing happening. They searched around with spotlights and got my report. Then I received a reimbursement for my stay and left. That was it. Obviously, I am confident that the man inside the house is the owner. Even more alarming, he was looking for me. When I awoke, I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs, indicating that he had entered the house and proceeded immediately upstairs to the bedroom. Only then did he return to search the remaining rooms. Fortunately, he investigated the living room last, and I had already woken up by then. So when he murmured, "Where the hell?" under his breath, it was most likely because he couldn't find me despite knowing I had to be inside somewhere. I'm not sure what would have occurred if I hadn't fallen asleep on the couch and been in one of the bedrooms when the guy entered the house. In general, however, I would have likely gone missing and not been seen again that night. I had reserved an Airbnb for 3 days. It was a modest spot in the woods, but not particularly private. It was in a community with plenty of woodland and land between the houses. This was my first time using Airbnb, so I didn't know much about the procedure or what to expect. When I arrived at the address about 5 p.m., I had no idea it would be exactly next to another property, literally 10 feet away. The rental was clearly a separate home, located on the same driveway as the main residence. I was expecting for something a little more private, but I was confident it wouldn't be as horrible as I imagined. I parked near the Airbnb and entered, then began to take my belongings from my car into the house. As I did, an older man emerged from the main house and approached my car. He introduced himself as Evan, the rental host. This man was in his 50s, and the simplest way to describe him was simply as a gigantic man, tall and broad, with a thick gray beard. He gave me an odd sense from the start, like something wasn't quite right about this person. He didn't say anything disturbing, but he kept calling me buddy, which was strange. After a few minutes, he left me to enjoy the Airbnb, and I hoped that would be my only interaction with him during my stay. Overall, I thought he was quirky yet harmless. I finished everything, relaxed on the couch for a while, and then made a late dinner. I believe I began cooking at 8:30 a.m. while on my way to the Airbnb. I had purchased a ribeye steak from the store, thinking it would be fun to cook on my first night there, not expecting how fatigued I'd be. I was starving, so I quickly fried it in a pan and ate it with no sides. Following that, I had an early shower and went to bed, passing out within a few minutes. I had nothing scheduled for the day other than returning to town to grab some groceries. After making coffee and waking up a little, I felt I'd better get that done early, so I could relax for the rest of the day. I went out to get some drinks and food for the following few days, then returned to the rental approximately an hour later. Evan walked out of his house just as I pulled up. He waved at me, and I assumed that was it. However, when I looked up again, he was approaching my car. I got out and began gathering the goods, hoping that he was simply going down to the mailbox or something. But as I turned back, he was standing directly above me. "How was your first night? Was things going well?" I said. "Everything was fine." He smiled and nodded. "How did the steak turn out last night? I hope my kitchen has everything you needed." I was taken aback for a moment. How the hell did he know what I cooked for dinner last night? I believe my expression revealed my disbelief, and I stuttered a few times when the man spoke again. "You mentioned yesterday that you picked up a steak for dinner." "Oh, yes. Yes, it was good. Thanks." He grinned again, nodded, and began walking back to his house. I hurried back inside. Did I actually tell him I brought a steak yesterday? I barely remembered our little talk since I was preoccupied with the strange feelings I had about him. But it didn't seem likely that I would just bring up what I was going to make for dinner. It was also remarkable that he immediately returned to his house. He came out only for the purpose of speaking with me again. The unpleasant sensations about him worsened, but I convinced myself that I must have mentioned the steak and simply forgot, and that Airbnb hosts talk to their customers frequently. I had no way of knowing because this was my first experience. Over the next few hours, I checked the windows to make sure Evan wasn't acting unusual. I never saw him, which provided some relief. I continued on with my day, which turned out to be quite nice since there was nothing else going on. I cooked dinner, watched television, and went to bed. However, when I awoke that night, I had no memory of hearing anything or having any reason for waking up, but I didn't feel well. I was uneasy. I sat up, and after a minute, I felt strange enough to get up and wander around the house. I slowly checked the rooms and ultimately arrived at the front door. It was unlocked. I opened it and glanced out. It was silent, and no one was outside, but I saw across the yard that Evan's house had a light on, despite the fact that the rest of the house was dark. I closed and locked it. I honestly don't know how. In the moment, I didn't consider why the door was unlocked. Perhaps I was too weary, or I simply imagined I had forgotten to lock it. But at the time, it didn't mean much to me. I just examined the house to ensure I was alone and that nothing else was wrong. Then I got back into bed and slept until 5 a.m. The sun hadn't yet risen, but I was wide awake because I hadn't given much consideration to anything until I awoke. That sense of being watched hung over me, and everything unusual that had happened since arriving at that rental was stacking up in my mind. Was I being watched? I dressed and resumed my trip through the home, but this time with more determination than in the middle of the night. I was looking for anything odd, and after only a few minutes of searching, I discovered something in the kitchen. One of the plugs had a black charging brick plugged in. Now, when I first saw it the day I came, I didn't think much of it. It even had a charging wire going out, so I assumed it was just a complimentary charger. But when I looked closer, I noticed a small dot on the front. I couldn't tell for sure, but it appeared to be a lens for a miniature hidden camera. I felt my face turn pale as I hastily disconnected it. I immediately rushed around the home, noticing that almost every room had one of these connected into an outlet, including the bedroom. And then I got interrupted. "Hello, would you mind opening the door for a minute? Just a few things to check." "Hello. Yes, I know you are in there. Can you open the door?" Evan called out from the front door. Coincidentally, just a few minutes after I discovered the cameras, his knocks became rapid and heavy, as if he was terrified. I instantly began packing everything in my room. I needed to leave now. As I was packing, he kept yelling out and beating the door until it became extremely silent, causing me to feel uneasy. I stopped moving and listened. He silently unlocked and opened the front door. I slammed the bedroom door, grabbed my suitcase, and exited through the window. As soon as I landed, I heard the bedroom door open and dashed to my car. I got inside and fled the house. I spent the day at a hotel an hour away from the Airbnb. I called friends and relatives to explain what had happened. And after consulting with them, I decided to call the cops. However, it did not turn out as expected. They came to his residence to question him, and he allowed them to check around. However, all of the charging bricks described had vanished, and Evan answered none of their queries honestly, claiming that everything I said had not occurred. Ultimately, it was my word against his, and nothing happened. Evan, I believe, came over to the rental with bad intentions to keep me from informing anyone about the cameras. Surprisingly, this pretty much indicates that he was actively monitoring and watching me via the cameras. I'm still really nervous thinking about being in that place and what could have occurred. I did observe, however, that he removed his Airbnb listing shortly after. And now, years later, I still don't see it there. A few years ago, I drove up to northern Minnesota to stay in a cabin rental. It wasn't fancy like Airbnb or anything. It was a privately owned establishment with a questionable website. However, the majority of personally owned and hosted remote cabin rental websites were out of date and badly designed. So this wasn't particularly exceptional. I'd done this a lot previously in several cabins. For my trip, I chose this one since it was inexpensive. The photographs of the surrounding forests looked pleasant, and it appeared to be a good place to lay low and relax for a few days away from the city in an area I had never been before. However, I felt strange almost from the moment I arrived at the cottage. It was the most distant I'd ever been, and my gut had a peculiar sensation about the woods. Looking out into the trees didn't make me feel tranquil. It felt frightening, as if something was out there, but I couldn't see anything. I tried not to think too much about it. I barely had a few hours left on that first day, so I stayed in and relaxed by the fireplace until I fell asleep, then went to bed. I awoke in the middle of the night, probably between 1 and 2 a.m., to a gentle sound outside the cabin. It seemed like something was moving around on the wooden porch directly outside the front door, but by the time I woke up, the sound had moved away. I hurriedly stood up and looked out the door, but there was no one there. There are no animals or anything. The woods were dark, and that eerie feeling came over me again. I closed it. I wasn't sure what I had heard, but I was certain I had heard it. Something was outside the front door. I stayed up for a time, but everything seemed to be quiet, so I eventually fell asleep again. The first few hours of the morning were peaceful. I ate and made coffee, but nothing much happened. Around noon, I really wanted to go for a stroll, and while I was concerned due to my gut feeling about the woods, I assured myself it was nothing and that a walk would be beneficial to me. I went out. There were no actual paths, at least not away from the cabin. So I just began walking in a straight path behind the cabin. I had just been walking for about 5 minutes when I stumbled into a route. It seemed like a faint trail meandering through the trees. Without any thought, I began to follow it. I wasn't sure if this was coming from people, someone strolling through the woods, or just wildlife. I got my answer not too far down, though. At the end, a big tent was built up, one of the large semi-permanent ones. A ton of old gear and rubbish littered the campsite, giving the impression that someone had lived there. The tent flap was open, and no one was inside, but it appeared that someone had been there recently. It certainly did not appear to have been abandoned. Knowing how near it was to the cabin I was staying in made me quite uncomfortable. I just waited for a minute before hurrying back to my cabin. When I got back, I called the host to see if I could get some answers, but I discovered that I didn't even have their phone number or any means to reach the owner other than through the email address on their website. My phone only had 1 bar of signal, making it difficult to accomplish anything. The tent or someone else being out in such a remote spot was already a bit much. But discovering all of this after having a lingering, creepy gut feeling was what kept me on edge. Like my body knew something I didn't, yet the woods remained empty and quiet for the rest of the day. As the sun fell, I decided that having a beer or two would help me relax. I stayed in the living room and drank for a while, but 20 minutes after the sun had set, I heard something at the front door. I stood up and looked at the door. As I approached carefully, I kept hearing this loud, scratching sound on the wood. I have no idea what I was hearing. When I went to the other side of the door, behind the scratches, I heard heavy breathing. "Hello, who is out there? What the hell are you doing?" I yelled. The clawing abruptly ceased, and footsteps scrambled away from the door. I opened it quickly, which was probably not a good idea, but I saw a man racing into the woods, and there were scars and scrapes on the face of the door. He used a tool to pry the door open. I immediately became sober and horrified. My initial concern was that if he came back and got in, no one else was out here to hear me scream for help or understand what was going on. That was a scary understanding to confront at that moment. I wasn't going to wait around. I dashed out and grabbed everything crucial I'd brought, stuffing it into my backpack before sprinting to my car. As I entered, it was incredibly silent outdoors. I turned it on and began to pull away. Basically, as soon as I hit the thicker area of the woods, with trees flanking the trail out, suddenly, a man raced in front of my car, forcing me to slam on the brakes and come to a stop. His eyes shone in the headlights, wide open and bloodshot, and he appeared dreadfully filthy and dirty, holding a crowbar. He began to rush around to my driver's side window, and when he wasn't in front, I floored it. I heard a bump as I passed him, which turned out to be him hitting the side of my car. I exited the woods and drove straight home. I spent the next few days attempting to discover a phone number or another way to contact the cabin rental's owners, but I was unsuccessful. Everything about that location was bizarre, and I am confident that I would not be here today if I had not left when I did.